long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined by my co-host, Ken Katkin, a professor of law at Chase Law School. Ken, it's wonderful to have you back as my co-host on The Politics Guys.
It's great to be back.
Yeah, I mean, last week it was moderate right and whatever, the rest of the right. And this week I get to come back home to my middle place and pulling you from the left a little bit back towards the center. That's what we'll try to do today. But we'll see how this works out on our first story, because I think one of our at least one of the stories that for me I thought was a major item was the DOJ indicting 2 Russian nationals. And I've been working on these names, Rostakint and I still got it wrong. Kalashnikov and Afasavia, I believe I'm getting that correctly this time, with violating the Foreign Agents Registration Act and committing money laundering. Now, what did these 2 employees of the Russian state-controlled RT media outlet, what were they doing? Well, they spent $10 million to distribute content to a United States audience with, quote, at least according to the indictment, hidden Russian government messaging, end quote. So, how did this work? Well, Russia Today, or RT, used the money to plant and finance a content creation company, and 2 American founders, at least according to the indictment, are aware of the issue. Not just aware, but complicit in it. Now, the indictment just calls the company U.S. Company Number 1, but outlets have already been able to connect you don't even need a media outlet. If you read it, it's pretty straightforward. That it is pretty certain that we're talking about Tenet Media. It has the same identical kind of header, name, founders, etc. So the Russians, as a matter of fact, provided 90% of Tenet's bank deposits to make it go on. Now, the 2 likely founders that are being referred to, again, not by name, but are Laura Shin, which is a conservative Canadian YouTuber, and her husband, Liam Donovan, who is the president of Tenet Media. And this isn't a small operation. It's a created content which has amassed over 16 million views, and that's just on YouTube alone. In short, Ken, I think we need a wider audience. But now, the other thing about that name, if it's not as familiar, you might want to go back and listen to the episode that I did with May last week. She actually talked a little bit about Lauren, who had taken issue with former President Trump about not going far right enough, especially when it comes to the issue of abortion. And May kind of respectfully disagreed with her by withholding her support from Trump. So yeah, it's the same person we were talking about. She is one of these 2. Now, Tenet has used a number of right-wing commentators. Now, for some listeners, you might be familiar with these, and for others, they might not be any different than my student's name, but it's Jenny Johnson, Tim Pool, Dave Rubin, and Lauren Southern. Now, I watched some of this stuff myself, Ken, and yeah, I mean, this is kind of your typical, I would call it pretty far right out there. I don't even know if we have a word for it anymore, but kind of that kind of online far right post conspiracy land. And now we have had some comments from these individuals saying, look, and this is true according to the indictment, that the particular commentators themselves were not aware of what was going on in this. But there is a bunch of evidence to suggest that the particular stories that these individuals were doing are being picked by RT. And in some cases, there's even some pushback about, well, which of the are Americans really going to buy it if we're that, if we push, content this particularly, forward. For example, Tim Pool has this video where he is just going off on how Ukraine is public enemy number 1 for the United States. And then there's some conversation about that seems to be alluded to in the indictment. So, Ken, I don't know how much of the indictment, like myself, you got to read. I read a lot of it. But what are your thoughts on this? both in terms of the Justice Department, coming down on this at this particular time, which is probably is a good thing, but what it kind of means about the political environment in general as well.
Yeah, well, I think the Justice Department, based on documents like the Mueller report, of course, has kind of a roadmap for how Russia interfered in the previous election and in the 2016 election as well. And so I think they were very leaning into it. That it was obvious that Russia's going to try to interfere in this election again because they've done it in the last two elections, and so they were much more proactive and much more vigilant about trying to see how that was unfolding and investigating it and being more active in real time. And so I'm definitely glad they're doing it. And I also like it that they indicted Russians, but they didn't indict these, the right wing commentators who are American. They do have their First Amendment rights. And I think the indictments fully respected that. So it's really just that the, Russian agents who are
and the two founders potentially.
And the two founders potentially who are being paid to act as Russian agents, in their case, presumably knowingly. But then you have all these other commentators who, for now, we have to assume that even though they were asked to talk about Ukraine a lot, they maybe didn't know that Russia was where the money was coming from. And, they can take the views that they take. But I think certainly anyone involved knowingly involved in a scheme by the Russian government to seed propaganda here to influence our election, they need to register as foreign agents, and they didn't do it. And so I think these are very good indictments.
One of the things that I have thought about, I agree with everything that you've said there, and certainly, Tim Pool is welcome to his opinions along with Jenny, Lauren, and Dave and the rest. But it reminds me a lot of the era when on the left, there was a significant amount of connection between kind of the former Russia, Soviet, right, kind of doing things not always with direct connections, but that were tied to Soviet outcomes. And here, if you were one of these individuals, you might want to say to yourself, okay, I can certainly have the views that I have. There's nothing that suggests in this indictment that any of these guys are doing anything particularly wrong. But it might be worth looking at your own philosophic positions if the propaganda machine of a country it aligns so well that you can become the mouthpiece unknowingly. What do you think? I don't know. I've been kind of mulling that over in my mind.
Yeah, I'm trying to think through that too. So you're saying like if maybe Tim Pool is being offered good money to make YouTube videos. He doesn't know that the money's sourced all the way back to Russia. He does know that they want him to talk about Ukraine a lot and other issues that are of particular concern to Russia, as well as just talking about the kind of stuff that he would choose to talk about anyhow. And I guess. So if I understood what you're asking correctly, even if he didn't know the money was coming from Russia, if he could see that his own views are lining up so well with Russian propaganda, should he ask himself, is that because I myself am falling victim to Russian propaganda?
Yeah, precisely. Yeah. Yes. In other words, again, not in a legal way, but just as an internal, like, hey, wait a second, maybe I need to be thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I like the comparison you made to the left, maybe during particularly the 30s, 40s, and early 50s in America, where you had this whole kind of group of Americans that sometimes went by the name the fellow travelers, right? And so the fellow travelers were not communists; they weren't members of the American Communist Party. They wouldn't have considered themselves to be working to advance the interests of the Soviet Union, but they had a lot of views in common with the communists, and they worked sometimes in connection with people who were the American Communist Party, I think it's a fair comparison, and I guess I think Americans can have the views that they have. I think it is. If it was me and I found that my views were aligning very much with foreign propaganda of a particular hostile foreign power, I would ask myself the questions that you're asking. But it's not like I just don't want to be saying that that they have to do that. I guess I consider it more to be a good practice. Yeah, more of a good practice than an obligation, I think.
Well, and the reason I say that, because I am, in fact, my particular, one of my, two particular areas of specialty are political communication. This is one of my areas. It's one of the things I try to help students with and think about. And in the contemporary social media world that we live in, because the algorithms which push the content that we see, they are neutral in the sense that they're all about engaging us repeatedly and for long periods of time. And that can create, once upon a time, we called them echo chambers, like when it came to like news radio. But today, the echo chamber is in some ways kind of a micro echo chamber. It's designed to keep pushing you further and deeper into particular goes. In my media and politics class, we actually do this experiment where we create dummy accounts. And by putting our eyeballs on different kinds of content for longer periods of time, or seemingly putting our eyeballs on content for time, we can get to some pretty incredibly troubling kinds of material. Now, again, I'm not asking for any of that material to be put away. I'm just suggesting that here, I think this is a kind of a great case example for what are the ways am I ensuring that those algorithms that are focusing my eyeballs on weird things haven't potentially influenced me in ways that I'm not aware of. Yeah, there's my soapbox for 2 seconds.
Well, the last thing I'd say about that, to tie it back to where we started, is that's one of the great benefits of these indictments, right? Because the indictments are targeted against the Russians and maybe the one or two culpable of Americans who knew that they were definitely taking money from the Russians to advance Russian propaganda. The indictments are targeted at them. They're not targeted at all the other commentators, but it does. But the fact that there's an indictment educates the whole public about where these people are coming from, right? You can see that they're part of a foreign-backed propaganda operation, even if they themselves might not have fully understood that. But that does have to make, I think, most ordinary listeners and viewers think about, well, if they're part of a Russian-backed propaganda operation, then probably the messages that they were articulating were Russian-backed propaganda.
Well, I think we've probably covered that. So, Ken, let's move to, some political races. And this week, it has looked close for a while, but this week, the 2024 Montana race, the U.S. Senate race, has gotten particularly interesting. Republican challenger Tim Sheehy is currently leading Democratic incumbent Jan Tester, according to the most recent polling. Sheehy holds a 6-point lead, which is above the margin of error over Tester. And this margin extends further as we take a look at older voters, specifically those aged 50 and older, where Sheehy leads by 17 points. And this race is one of those pivotal races for the balance of power in the U.S. Senate. Tester is a 3-time incumbent, facing a very tough battle, especially, like I noted, among those older adults and rural voters who are leaning considerably more conservative, although she is relatively a moderate on this front. And this follows, and it's not like this poll is out of the blue. We've had a number of polls now going back weeks and months where it was a statistical tie, meaning everything was within the margin of error. And this is a good time of the year as we're kind of in the official season. For those of you, I know you guys look at the polling data yourself. Even like Real Clear Politics is not real clear when it comes to being honest about their polling. Yeah, you laugh because you know what I'm about to say. They give you these plus and minuses, but if you look more carefully at the data, they also give you what's called the margin of error. And if that lead is not within the margin of error, that is actually a statistical tie. We don't know anything. And so all this, like they're up 1, they're up 2, they're up 3. Generally speaking, most of these polls, and you can look at Real Clear, they do have it there as well. They have a margin of error, oftentimes 4.5 percentage points, meaning that until you get outside of that, we don't actually know anything. It is just a statistical tie. But they only put a tie if they actually have a dead tie. And so we've had statistical ties. So if you're looking at it, just a heads up, you're not going to see that immediately until you drill down a bit deeper. But yeah, we've had statistical ties, and this is the first one. And I think it points to a potential shift. And so, Ken, I want to start here with Montana, but I want to get to some other races as well as we kind of think about the Senate. But I thought Montana would be a really good place to start thinking about election season and who's going to be holding this U.S. Senate.
Yeah, I mean, of course, you're right that Tester. I've seen polls where he's down by 6, where he's down by 7. I haven't seen anywhere he's doing a lot better than that. So that really means two things for the Dems. Either he needs to pick up a few more votes between now and election day, or you can always put some hope in the idea that polling is less accurate in smaller populations than it is in larger populations, right? So maybe, even though this poll has a margin of error, and you're absolutely right that the gap is wider than the margin of error. Still, polls are less predictive when you have smaller samples of smaller populations than when you have larger samples of larger populations. But nonetheless, I'm not, if that election was held today, it's not like I'm saying I think Tester could win today very easily. I think he does need to close it up. There may be some possible contrary movement in some other states. Things are actually closing up a little bit in Texas, I think. Not nobody really thinks Cruz is going to get dumped, but I think right now Cruz's lead is less than the Montana Republicans' lead over Tester. So maybe something could happen in another state. Florida. Most people think that Rick Scott is pretty rock solid to get reelected, but
although if you look at the data, the most recent data, Ken, in Texas. Cruz is a little bit further, but Scott is in fact within the margin of error in the last two polls.
Yeah, and I was also going to add that the abortion ballot initiative could actually change some.
Oh, please continue.
As that becomes a reality in Florida, right? Because Florida has right now a 6-week abortion ban that's very unpopular in Florida, and they have a bill on the November ballot to get rid of that. And I think that probably will improve turnout for groups that would probably vote Democratic. So I think the polls are capturing what people have been telling pollsters over the last few weeks. But the more people really hear about the abortion ballot initiative, I think that could change the electorate that comes to the polls. So I'm gotta hope that there might be a pickup here or there for the Dems. Certainly the Dems have to be prepared for a loss possible in Montana, and I would say a loss certain in West Virginia, where Manchin, who's actually not even a Democrat anymore because he's independent now, but he's still caucusing with the Democrats, but that's going to go Republican. So really the best case scenario for the Dems probably is a 50-50 Senate where Harris gets elected and Tim Walz can break the ties. But I don't see a better outcome for Dems really on the table.
And I mean, and you haven't even mentioned Ohio, where Brown is tied statistically with the challenger. And so I'm not suggesting that means he's going to lose, but similarly in the way we're talking about Scott, there is a reason to think that Dems could lose too. And in which case then it becomes even more difficult. And you're absolutely right.
Yeah, I mean, and not only Ohio, I think Nevada also. There's definitely some states where the Dem is a little ahead, but it's close and sometimes within the margin of error. I have tremendous faith in Sherrod Brown. He has won a few times when he was down in the polls, and also this time he has the good fortune to be running against this real clown Bernie Moreno. So I think he's going to hang on. But yeah, I mean, it's at least as likely that the Republicans could knock off a Dem as that Texas or Florida could go to the Dems for sure. So, it's not looking great for the Dems. I think the White House, I've always said all year long, I was saying Biden's going to win. I'm saying Harris is going to win. I actually think that's not so. I'd bet, to me, that's a lot more predictable than the Senate, where I'm going to have to say it could be bleak.
No, I agree. I mean, we disagreed a little bit. I thought if Biden continued, I was already calling for Trump to win, but that was assuming he was facing Biden. But when you take a look at the most recent data, I think we completely agree now. I think Harris is in the driver's seat at the moment, but I don't think it is particularly likely that she definitely does not face a completely unified Democratic Congress, and it could be the case like we're talking about here. I would put right now, if you were going to make me put the money down, I would say that it is more likely than not that Republicans take control of the Senate and not by a big margin continue to narrowly hold the House.
Yeah, I probably have to agree with you on the Senate. I think probably the most likely outcome is 51-49 Republican in the Senate. I don't. I do think the Dems are going to take the House because there's a lot going on in New York and California, and it would only take big wins in New York and California. They wouldn't need to really change the map much anywhere else for the Dems to take the House. So I think the Dems will get the House. I think the biggest winner
So a
in the
flip,
whole
in other words, we'll go
flip,
from
I
a
think.
Senate House to House. Okay, okay.
And both very narrow. But I think the biggest winner if that happens is going to be Attorney General Merrick Garland, because if Harris could get anybody else confirmed, he's gone. But I think if she can't get anyone else confirmed, he's got 4 years more of job security.
That, I'll be honest, the last thing I had thought about was the job security of Garland when I was thinking about this.
The incumbents in Biden's cabinet will have to stay in unless she can actually get her picks confirmed. And I feel like if the Republicans only have 51-49, it's going to be hard for her to get a lot of people confirmed, even to her own cabinet, much less to the judiciary.
No, I mean, that is absolutely fair. We already saw that in terms with Biden when it came to we talked about on the show with the military appointments with just one individual. So yeah, no, I deeply agree with that. Well, let's move forward a little bit here, Ken. Let's talk Hunter Biden. So on Thursday, Hunter Biden, the son of President Joe Biden, surprisingly pled guilty to felony tax charges in a federal court in Los Angeles. This was after attempting to offer this kind of specialty plea where you're admitting to you're going to pay, you're going to be guilt, but you're not admitting to the actual guilt of the crime. I know that sounds a little bit confusing, but there is kind of a gray area for that in some cases. But this caught everybody a little bit flat-footed. And so after a recess, his attorney changed and said that he agreed that he would simply plead guilty right down the line to all of the charges. The decision, of course, was unexpected as jury selection for the trial was about to begin on Thursday. Now, as a result of that guilty plea, Hunter Biden admits to failing to pay over $1.4 million in taxes from 2016 to 2019. And that's something that Ken and I have actually talked about on the show. His plea came without any deal for a lighter sentence, leaving the possibility of significant prison time, up to 17 years. Although, if you take a look at most experts, and we're going to turn to you in a second, Ken, a lighter sentence is pretty likely based on federal guidelines. Now, the guilty plea follows his earlier conviction this year on unrelated gun charges, which they really stem from a lot of his struggles with drug addiction. Doesn't necessarily excuse it, but that's the era that we're talking about. Now, the decision to plead guilty avoided what clearly would have been a politically charged trial, particularly for Republicans keen to continue to highlight his foreign business dealings. And this is something that we, Ken, you and I had looked into, that I had kind of really poked on a little bit. But Hunter's sentencing for the tax charges is scheduled for December 16th, a little bit later this year, and then our sentencing on the gun charges in November. And the upside, again, to the guilty plea is he's not going to have any more, as what he had said, public embarrassment. Specifically, he doesn't want to have anything looked into Burisma, the scandal-plagued Ukrainian energy company, or the now bankrupt Chinese conglomerate. And it's going to make things a little bit easier. What Biden himself said was, quote, "I went to trial in Delaware not realizing the anguish it would cause my family, and I will not put them through it again. When it became clear to me that the same prosecutors were focused not on justice, but on dehumanizing me for my actions during my addiction, there was only one path for me." I found that a little bit of a, it felt kind of Trump victimized here. Like, listen, I was addicted to drugs, so, oopsie daisy, I forgot to pay $2 million. I think he would have been better off just shutting up and going home. But he said what he said. And then he moved on to say, we're going to need more. My family doesn't need more pain and any more invasions of privacy or needless embarrassment, end quote. So thoughts about kind of this surprise guilty plea, Ken?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. I mean, I wasn't as put off by his statement as you were, I guess, because I think two things are both true, right? I agree with you. He's guilty. But yet, I don't think it's that common to have this level of resources dedicated to prosecution of a tax evasion trial in a case where the tax evader has already basically confessed, paid up, apologized, paid some extra interest, and it doesn't otherwise seem to be
But now
any kind of
to be
ongoing.
clear, he is not
Yeah.
completely paid up. I mean,
The back taxes, I thought he had. Am I wrong about that?
I don't think so. I think that is part of what. Continue, and I will make sure that I'm right about that. But continue.
Yeah, I mean, you could be. I certainly just thought, I didn't double check that. I thought that he had, yeah. So I think there is a political aspect to this. I mean, especially the fact that there was a special prosecutor appointed for a crime like this. I mean that it's not a crime. He was never a government official. This was not a crime that involved any kind of abuse of government power. He was just an ordinary tax evader who also happened to be a drug addict. And I think the reason that this level of prosecutorial resources went into this case instead of just the government accepting some kind of settlement where
it does not appear that he's paid. Continue.
Okay, I will accept that then. I mean, he certainly must be thinking he's going to pay now if he's pleading guilty, and he's going to wind up paying clearly. A lot more. Yeah. And he wanted to do the Alford plea. In case the listeners were interested in that, an Alford plea is a technical form of pleading where the defendant in a criminal case can say, I understand that the prosecutor is capable, by evidence that he has, of proving my guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. So therefore, it's not necessary to have a trial, but I'm just not willing to say that I'm guilty. And it's up to a judge whether they accept a plea like that. Normally, in a normal guilty plea, part of the process of pleading guilty, which is called allocuting, an allocution is where the person who pleads guilty has to make a statement admitting they are guilty and accepting responsibility for their guilt. And so the big difference between an Alford plea and a guilty plea is just whether there has to be an allocution or not. And he was hoping he wouldn't have to do one, but he will, for his guilty plea to be accepted. That's the other part
that kind of rubbed me. I guess I was reading his comments in light of that, Ken, which is in part to say, it seemed like at first he wanted to say, well, I didn't really not pay the taxes. But again, it is pretty apparent, man, you didn't pay the taxes. I don't know.
Right. You got that exactly right.
Had he not, had he just come in and said, hey, not guilty, I don't think his comment would have caught me as disingenuous and as sleazy as it did in the context of saying, well, I want to do it this way. Oh, I guess I can't. So fine, guilty. That was how I'm going to read that. I'll be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. I mean, I think if you kind of think of why do we even have something called an Alford plea, there could be situations where the defendant basically says, I've been framed and I didn't do it, but I can see that I've been framed so well that any jury is going to convict me. And so I can't really go to trial. I know I'll lose, right? And so that's sort of, I think, the concept behind an Alford plea. But again, it is discretionary on the part of the judge whether they'll accept it or not. And in this case, the judge read it, Trey, exactly the way you read it, so that the judge just wouldn't allow him to do that. Mm-hmm. I think for the same reasons that you didn't like it, right? That the judge just said, look, in this case, you're not framed, you're guilty. And if you want to plead guilty, you're going to have to come in and allocute. You're going to have to explain that you are guilty, that you did the things that you're accused of, and that you accept responsibility for that. And so that kind of allocution is required in an ordinary guilty plea before the sentence can be issued. And if somebody doesn't want to allocute, they actually have to plead not guilty, and so they have to go to trial. So that's the normal process, and then the Alford plea is a different process. But I also think another thing about Hunter Biden, and I don't even know if I have a view about whether this is good or bad, but I think part of what's going on here is, now that Joe Biden is not a candidate and is not going to be the president in January, there is this lame duck period after Election Day and before Inauguration Day. And I do think that if there's prison time granted, I'm going to say the odds are very high that there will be a pardon. If there's no prison time granted and it's just fines plus community service or something like that, I don't think there'll be a pardon. But I think Hunter Biden, is basically gambling that a trial itself would be horrific for him, and the consequences of a guilty plea really can't be as horrific, because even though prison is on the table in the courtroom, I think it's not really on the table in the real world.
That might be that is I had thought a little bit about that, Ken, but that'll be something we'll have to take on, I suppose, if and when it occurs. I do think, though, now that we're living in a post President, Joe Biden re-election season, I think these things are not going to have the same kind of political weight they would have had and might ought to have had he been the candidate, but he's not. And so
he's not.
Yeah.
So it opens up a lot more space for him to quietly give a pardon, and it's not going to be the top headline in the news that day.
Yeah. Well, let's continue to move forward. The other big item this weekend was that U.S. Navy Secretary Carlos del Toro violated the Hatch Act by making political statements endorsing President Biden during an official trip to the UK back in January of this year. Now, for listeners, the Hatch Act, what it does basically is prohibit federal employees from engaging in political activity, not all the time, but while they're acting in their official capacity. Now, in this case, Del Toro, during interviews with the BBC and then later at a speech in London, expressed confidence that Americans would support Biden's reelection and implicitly criticized the challenger in former President Trump. Now, although Del Toro later self-reported his comments to the Office of Special Counsel and argued his remarks were kind of spontaneous responses to questions, the OSC ruled this did not actually absolve him of the violation. So the case has been referred to the White House, but it's kind of unclear what, if any, penalties might happen. Possible consequences include fines or potentially even removal from service. So again, in this case, the individual has even kind of reported on themselves that didn't end up changing anything, though. Ken, what do you think about this? This can be a difficult line sometimes for individuals. That kind of the space between who you are as a public persona and who you are as a private person, I will be honest, can be a difficult one to navigate, I think. So what do you think about this particular set of what has been decided by the OSC to be a Hatch violation?
Yeah, well, I like the Hatch Act. I think it's a good statute, and I think although it was originally I think enacted against President Franklin Roosevelt, and I think people there were concerns mostly from Republicans, but also from some centrist and conservative Democrats at the time that a lot of the big New Deal programs which were employing a lot of Americans, things like the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Products Administration, were basically partly being used as political operations for FDR, and so this law was passed to really say that if someone's on the job working for the United States government doing their federal job, unless they are an elected official or certain other kinds of political positions which are exempt, that they should not be engaging in partisan politics. Now, sometimes they that doesn't usually cover kind of issue politics. It really has been limited mainly to covering politicking or electioneering around individual candidates for office. So necessarily civil servants in the Biden administration who are carrying out the administration's policies in some ways are going to be that there's some political aspect to advancing the president's agenda, but what they're prohibited from doing is actually trying to speak in ways that could be speaking in favor of one candidate over another, typically the incumbent over people who are trying to unseat the incumbent. I think it's a good law. I think the penalties are not severe. The most severe aspects of the penalties are job actions. There's no criminal liability, and the civil fines are relatively low. The most significant possible penalties are federal employees being disciplined up to or including being fired from federal jobs. That seems appropriate to me. I'll say I don't think this was a very severe case. I agree it was a violation. He self-reported it as a violation, and that's actually how it came about that the special counsel's office had to issue an opinion, because the information they received was all self-reported, and it seems relatively minor to me. But I think it's a good law. I think it applies here. I think he did it, and I also think it's about as minor a violation as I've seen.
Yeah, I agree. And But this is one of those acts, and I like that you went back a little bit of the history. I had wondered about how much we should talk about that. but one of the things that it is easy to forget was there was a significant period in American history. Sometimes we think of it as kind of being the era of the machine, but the idea that the jobs you held were because of a particular candidate, and so your job required you effectively to be endorsing and working for, as you had pointed, generally the incumbent, not necessarily always the president, right? Right. But in that kind of manner. Today, that is not, because of the way we've changed the bureaucracy of the federal government, that is not as prominent. But I agree with you. This is an example of where, okay, there can be that kind of line, even if I ultimately agree with Toro. I don't want Donald Trump, but I don't want the U.S. Navy Secretary making that kind of proclamation. But no, so I agree with you. I think kind of right down the line.
I should add something. I mean, Trump is actually very much, it's part of Project 2025. And not only that, it's something that he already did in the final year of his administration. He's very much trying to undermine the Hatch Act. And he actually did issue an executive order in his final months in office in 2020 to undermine the Hatch Act. It didn't have time to get implemented. So we didn't really see the effect of this. But
and then it was overturned by Biden. Yeah, but continue. Let's talk about it. Yeah, and then it was rescinded
by Biden. But the executive order that he called Schedule F was to create a new schedule within the civil service called Schedule F, where people who today are classified as civil servants who would be both protected with job protections against adverse job actions because of what political party they're in, but in exchange for that, people who have those kinds of job protections are governed by the Hatch Act, and they're not supposed to be out there politicking. And Trump's idea of Schedule F, which he literally did issue, this wasn't just an idea, this was an actual executive order, said that the heads of every agency in the United States government should try to identify jobs within their agency that right now today are classified as civil service jobs, but that in fact exercise some policymaking authority, and that they should reclassify all of those jobs into this new Schedule F, which would take them out of the civil service and make them all political appointees. And if they were not civil servants, but instead were political appointees, then they wouldn't be governed by the Hatch Act. So this was really a concept of transforming a significant amount, big percentage of the federal civil service into political jobs, and then part of the job would be electioneering for the president.
Well, as I used to say, Ken, when this first came up, F is for family, Schedule F. But I mean, I'm teasing, but I'm also being a little bit serious there. That was an absolute. That was former President Trump absolutely attempting to turn the federal government further into kind of the Trump business. And that was just clearly what that was going on there, and it was wrong. As a matter of fact, I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, because the kind of conduct that we just saw being a violation of the Hatch Act, if that job position had been redefined as no longer a civil service job, then that kind of conduct therefore would not be governed by the Hatch Act. So it would actually be expected from people in positions like that.
And when we say expected, what we mean is that your boss might expect you to be promoting him or her. So, well, since we're talking a little bit about Trump, that's kind of a pretty good segue here, Ken, to talk about the SAVE Act. Now, earlier this week on Tuesday, former President Donald Trump warned Republicans that they have to pass the SAVE Act. As a matter of fact, what he would write on Truth Social is, quote, "Our whole voting system is under siege," end quote. Now, what is the SAVE Act? It's an amendment to the National Voter Registration Act. And what it would do is require states to obtain proof of citizenship from voters for federal elections and require purging non-citizens from voter rolls. In his words, quote, "Republicans must pass the SAVE Act or go home and cry yourself to sleep," end quote. He would write on Truth Social again last Tuesday. He would also go on to say that non-citizen illegal, I just want to be clear, I am just reading this verbatim. No, I'm not getting this wrong. Non-citizen illegal migrants, capitalized, are getting the right to vote, being pushed by crooked Democrat politicians who are not being stopped by an equally dishonest Justice Department, end quote. So The goal seems to be here, and that's kind of emerged as we've moved deeper into the week, Ken, to attach the SAVE Act to a stopgap bill on the House floor next week. So this House floor would be a stopgap spending bill. It would then require this SAVE or this proof of citizenship voting bill, and then extend government funding into 2025, basically punting it, as we often always do, past the election. So I looked at this because this kind of comes up regularly, Ken. Everywhere I have lived has always had a voter ID. And I think for many citizens, depending on where you've lived, many listeners, you might wonder, like, well, where is this? So there are, specifically in the Northeast and in the West, as you get west of Oklahoma, there are many states that either any kind of ID that doesn't have a photo or no ID at all is required. The two most prominent, of course, is California and New York, that have no ID required at all to vote. And I think that those, I mean, they're not the only two, but they're the two large. Well, I guess Pennsylvania is in that list too. And of course, Illinois has to be in that list. So, I mean, Ken, I'm not sure how good the politicking of this is when it comes to attaching it to the spending bill. But look, this is not my issue. You know, listen, if anything, I fall in some weird places on these. But it is weird to me. This seems like an easy win for Democrats in some ways. Like the response from some on the left saying, well, look, having an ID is just so onerous. And I think, well, is it though? I don't know. I this is one where I don't maybe have it. Maybe you disagree deeply on this one, but I don't know how the politicking necessarily is going to help Republicans on trying to attach this to the SAVE Act. I certainly think that Trump's underlying decision in most cases is he's trying to do things that are helping himself. But be that as it may, the actual SAVE Act itself and the idea of having uniform voter ID just does not seem like that big of a problem to me. What do you think?
Well, the SAVE Act, independent of the stopgap bill is one thing, and the SAVE Act tied to the stopgap bill is another thing.
Exactly. That's why I'm setting it up that way for us, right? Absolutely, absolutely.
Right, because I think that so there's sort of two things you talked about in the merits of the SAVE Act. One would be prohibiting non-citizen voting, and one would be tightening photo ID requirements.
Well, it would make all the states that don't currently have it have to have it at least for the federal portion of their elections.
Yeah. So I'll separate those two things. So the issue about not allowing non-citizens to vote, I mean, that's 100% phony issue, right? Non-citizens already are not allowed to vote, there's literally nothing at stake in terms of, so that legislation I think you have to think of as 100% about messaging, right? And I tend to think, if you ask the question, why do Republicans want to prohibit non-citizen voting when they all know that non-citizen voting is already prohibited? It seems like to me there's sort of a continuum. Some of them it's mainly because they just think, well, we may know that, but not all our voters know that, and so we want to look like we're doing something. Or the other may be just that I think someone like Trump would think the more he can sort of pretend that there's weaknesses in the current electoral system, the more he can complain when he loses that it's because he was cheated somehow. So sort of teeing that up. So that part of it,
and that's why, as a Democrat, I would totally pass. I mean, I don't think it fundamentally changes anything. I think having a photo ID required in some states is probably not a bad idea, and I can't imagine it hurting. And that would be the only part that changes something.
Well, we just got it in Ohio, so I was just looking into this. In fact, I will put in a plug for myself. I was on Channel 5 News in Cincinnati today talking about the Ohio law that does now tighten up the photo ID requirements. So as recently as the last election in 2022, in Ohio, the photo ID would let people vote, but other kinds of ID that weren't photo ID could be used. So if somebody had a gas or electric bill that had their address on it and their name, or if they had a bank statement that had their address on it and their name, those could work in Ohio in 2022. They won't work anymore. So it's 100% photo ID now. So a lot of people have been looking into this and asking, well, what's the impact going to be? And it turns out that even though most people in Ohio have driver's licenses. The Bureau of Motor Vehicles in Ohio will give non-driver's licenses to people who need ID, even if they don't drive. U.S. passports are also accepted in lieu of licenses, and military ID is accepted in lieu of licenses. So there's those four forms of photo ID. It does turn out that 8% of the registered voters in the state don't have any of those forms of ID. So it is going to probably result in some suppression of legitimate votes. Now, certainly some of those people might go out and get the photo ID for non-drivers that you can get at the BMV, and they've actually made that free, although it's not necessarily free for people to pull together all the documents. Like if they need to go order a new copy of their birth certificate, that's not free. But if they show up at BMV with all the right documents, they can get a non-voter's photo ID or non-driver's photo ID for free that they can use for voting purposes. Some people will just vote absentee because you still don't need a photo ID to vote absentee, although they tightened up the laws about how you can deliver those to the Board of Elections, and they mostly now will have to be mailed, whereas in the past they could mostly be mailed or dropped off. So there are ways that people can do it, and I'm sure some people will adapt to that. But I've got to think that if 8% of the people in the state right now who can vote don't have a photo ID that will get them in, and I'm thinking the population who's like that, you're probably talking about the most marginal segment of the population, most likely, maybe very old people, or maybe, people who've never had enough money to drive or things like that. I'm not sure they're all going to have the wherewithal to vote. And again, in a state like this where, some elections, probably Sherrod Brown's election, will be decided by very thin margins, lobbing off, even 1 or 2% of the electorate could change the outcome. So I do think the issue is serious. And I think that the quantity of disenfranchisement that is going to happen because of these photo ID laws is much greater than the quantity of in-person vote fraud that was ever taking place before we had all these photo ID laws.
Now, I haven't looked, so you had obviously taken a look at Ohio. I had not looked particularly at Ohio's shift in those numbers. And listen, anytime we have those kinds of items come up, you're right. You are making something a little bit harder, a little bit more difficult. But I had thought about that in general, not the particular number of 8%. But there are so many ways that we now require there to be photo IDs to just simply exist your life, Ken, that I hear that argument. But at the same time, then it seems to me you'd have to say the same thing for, say, well, if I need to get on a plane, if I need to, it can in certain federal buildings to get, you have to have a photo ID. So we seemingly are willing to lop off particular populations for sets of things, but not for voting. And I hear you. I mean, one possibility is to say, well, voting is so fundamentally different that therefore the ill that would come of it would be worse than the good. But as a guy who tends towards wanting less kinds of regulation on things sometimes, it seems more like an argument to be said that, well, then why aren't we kind of cutting these photo IDs in other places where there are pain points? So, for example, in certain kinds of banking, again, just to bring up. So what's your thought on that front? Because I did think about that. Again, I didn't know the 8% particularly. So what are your thoughts about then on the other side of that equation? Why not loosen it on other items?
Well, I mean, I guess I'm just going to have to make some hypotheses or surmises here. I don't know the answers to all the factual questions here, but it seems to me that if 8% of the people in Ohio don't have any photo ID, you're definitely talking about people who haven't been on an airplane, right? So when we say you need a photo ID to get on an airplane, yes, but you're really looking at a different, I think either a different socioeconomic bracket than who rides on airplanes, or maybe even just a different age bracket than who still rides on airplanes. And so I do think that it's just really, it's going to be marginal people who are getting cut. Most people are living.
I absolutely agree. And so that's why I also bring up the banking, right? I mean, the ability to have just your basic finances. We have said, nope, you gotta have certainly this kind of ID to make it happen. And that one's far more universal. It is universal, unlike voting. So again, maybe here I'm being more left as the devil's advocate on the
Well, my grandmother, she had to finally learn to drive when my grandfather died. But my grandmother lived into her almost 70 before she learned how to drive, and I don't think she had a photo ID before that. I don't know what she would have ever needed it for. Now I know you need it for more things now than you did in the 20th century, but
Right.
I think especially among the elderly, people who are living in urban areas where they don't need to drive, and people, who don't, just wouldn't customarily do things like fly. I think that those populations must exist, and so I just don't. I think if you compare it with the flip side of this, is if you tell people you can vote if you show your utility bill or your bank statement or something like that. Are people really using that to do impersonation and committing in-person voter fraud? I don't think there's much evidence of that. So I would just compare, how many people are going to be disenfranchised just by virtue of the fact that they are kind of marginal people who don't live in the same modern world that you and I live in, versus, on the other side of the balance, how many people are really like figuring out how to fake up an electric bill or a gas bill of a real person and then go down and pretend to be somebody else and then get away with voting that way. That would be prosecuted, and there's not too many cases out there where that's been prosecuted.
Well, Ken, I appreciate it, and I think we'll need to end the show right there.
Can we quickly talk about the linking of the SAVE Act to the shutdown bill, though?
Oh yes, please do.
Yeah. So that, I think the strategies become a lot more clear, because I think when we're just talking about these SAVE Act issues, freestanding, there's policy questions we were just talking about. There's certainly politics questions where there's going to be partisan divides about what's right and what's wrong. But I think when we talk about, if the House Republicans offer a bill where they say, here's the SAVE Act, we're marrying it to the continuing resolution that's needed to keep the government open, and if the Senate doesn't pass the SAVE Act, then we're going to shut down the government, and they're doing this in October, right before the election. It just seems to me like Chuck Schumer is salivating, like, let the House Republicans shut down the government right now as we're coming into the election, and just show the American public how unfit they are to govern. It just seems like a no-brainer that the Senate would never, take up that bill, and so there will be a government shutdown. And it's hard for me to
on that part. Here's the I think on that part, and maybe I wasn't spending as much time thinking about it, because that's not going to happen. We're not going to shut it down right before. What's going to happen is House Republicans are going to pass that. They're going to send it over to Democrats in the Senate. The Democrats in the Senate are going to say, absolutely, no way not. That creates an issue that you can run on and say, see, the Democrats in the Senate, they don't really care about election integrity. That bill comes back, and then at the last minute, Johnson pulls out, like we always do. The whole world is watching, pulls out the other bill that's going to push it. We pass that all through. Everybody looks in the camera and goes, job well done, and moves on. But you then get the other side having to take that vote in the first hand. That's what happens. I am 100%.
but I don't. I guess you got to explain to me under that scenario. That seems like an abject defeat of the Republicans, right? I mean, if the Republicans say, we're not going to pass a continuing resolution until we also get the SAVE Act, and you're already saying, well, the end of this story is they passed the continuing resolution without getting the SAVE Act, then I don't know how that benefits them to just show themselves, to be so ineffective when they make an ultimatum like that.
But here's the problem: like the two of us and others, and many of the listeners who are listening to this show, right? We are looking and thinking about this in long-term context. And I think the same thing applies here that helped me understand the way that Donald Trump communicates. And that is that everything is its own X or Twitter soundbite. And there is no connection to the thing that came before it purposefully. And that's because when you're looking and you're polling at the average data, people are not paying attention to that. They're going to pay attention to the thing that you actually bring the attention to. So I hear what you're saying. Like if we were writing a narrative in a story and someone's reading this in a novel and they're going to go like, man, that's a stupid plot hole, right? That's the dumbest thing I've ever seen. But we don't vote on plot holes, right? Like nobody is doing the narrative. Yeah, that's
I'm
my
just saying,
answer.
If there are MAGA voters out there who are paying enough attention to congressional goings on that they're like excited that Johnson is saying, I'm going to shut down the government unless they
to be
pass
clear,
the SAVE
he
Act.
hasn't said that yet. in those exact words. He has not said that precisely.
Right. But that's the concept of tying it to the continuing resolution, right?
Concept, but I'm just
all right. All right, I hear you. Because I'm just saying, if that's what he's selling, then he has to come up short, well before the election, because this has to be resolved by September 30th.
Does he come up short, or does he show who doesn't really care about election integrity right before an election?
Oh, I see what you're saying. All right. Yeah. All right.
Okay. So again, I want to be clear here. I'm not endorsing this as a good view. I started that off with that, but I'm just analyzing it. And that's what I am. If there's anything that's 100% sure I've been on, there's one of them. Okay. Well, we better stop the show here where I know that I'm right, because it's going to be all downhill. After that, if you're not already a supporter of the Politics Guys, I really hope you can become one. It is supporters that keep the podcast going. And when you become a supporter, you get all kinds of good stuff. Supporters can also join our very active Discord group. We've been doing all kind of cool things. Matter of fact, last week, May and I did a whole supporters exclusive show, a benefit show, just answering your questions. And that was a whole lot of fun. So to check this all out, head to patreon.com/politicsguys. And if you'd like to support us in a different way, there's a ways to do that, including on Venmo, where we're at Politics Guys. We're also on PayPal. Hey, just go ahead and scroll down right now to the show notes. I've got all of those support links there for you. And if you'd just like to put it in, or maybe talk to Siri, head to politicsguys.com/support. Now, if you'd like to get that midweek show, now heads up, Ken and I are going to be recording our supporters midweek show in just moments, where we've been going through the U.S. Constitution, and we're getting into the 13th and 14th Amendment. So if you want to get those shows, you want to head to patreon.com/politicsguys and make sure that you're on the right level of support to be getting that. Now, if you don't have the financial ability to do that, and I get that, I am not the most well-paid person in the world, and I got 3 kids. Please just email us at mail@politicsguys.com, and we can work some things out. Now, whether you're a supporter or not, I really would appreciate it if you would subscribe, rate, review on whatever podcast app you use. And of course, if there was something you liked, grab it and share that on social media. If you've got any kind of questions you want to share with us, you can always reach us again at mail@politicsguys.com. We're also on Facebook and X. You'll find all of those links in the show notes. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Marino, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new episode next week, and I hope you'll join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.